Next speaker for this morning session is Professor Ranulph Glanville. Dr. Glanville is a professor of architecture and cybernetics at the Bartlett University College in London. He is also a professor of research in industrial design engineering at the Royal College of Art, London, and an adjunct professor of design research at Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. He's more than 300 publications, and he has an art and design practice. He's on the editorial board of 7 journals and is an officer of 5 societies, including a fellow vice president, president-elect of American Society of Cybernetics. He has 2 PhDs and a Doctor of Science. His 1975 cybernetics PhD has been selected by the British Library as one of the 600 key pre-digital PhDs to be digitized. He travels the world advising universities as a professor of odd jobs. He has consulted in a variety of areas, from a mental health hospital to a bank, and from universities to the creation of a CAD system for designers. His keynote address is Reflecting Between Understanding and Acting. Professor Glanville.
Thank you. That needs an update. That is so out of date and so wrong, but never mind. It's, of course, a pleasure to be here and to be allowed to address you. Thank you. You will see the number 28 appears, and I will tell you at the end why it appears. So if you're interested, that'll keep you here. And we'll start with this. Now, I don't normally start with a picture of me, but I want to talk, as lots of people have, about something to do with the relationship between theory and practice. And I come from a different sort of practice than most of the people here. So I want to try to bring some of that approach to practice to you. What I'm going to do is to take a number of ideas that you've heard from many people during the course of the last couple of days, and perhaps organize them a little bit differently. In doing that, what I hope to do is not to end up being desperately out of date. I had a book published by Karl Müller fairly recently, and I had a very nice review from an outstanding German academic. And what he actually said was, the ideas when he was young were terribly exciting and fantastic, and he's just been sitting around since then. So it's sort of, this thing that you become a dinosaur. And I'm trying not to become a dinosaur, and I will explain to you how I'm trying not to become a dinosaur in the course of this talk. At least I hope I will. I think there's a very big problem to do with application and practice. And that's, I suppose, what I'm going to try to approach. Application is, for me, a really dirty word. And I will explain to you why I think it's dirty and inappropriate, and why we need to start thinking in a slightly different way. Application is, for me, a theorist's word, and it's funny that I use this word, or that I object to it, because I regard myself mainly as a theorist. I'm not going to talk about things like the cybernetics of cybernetics, which Carl talked about yesterday. But behind what I'm saying is that notion of reflexivity, of recursion and so on, which is what you find in phrases like the cybernetics of cybernetics. And really what I'm talking about most of all is my attempt over the past few years to learn to live in second-order cybernetics rather than just to talk about it. And for me, that's really one of the main problems that we have to face. It's how to do these things, not how to talk about them. And that's the major thing that I'll get through. I think I've finished that bit of animation. Yes, so I'll get on with the serious stuff. I want to give you a little bit of background, and this has to do with the way that I grew up, but I don't believe that it's different to the way that most of us grew up. So what I'd like to begin with is this notion that somehow or other we apply theory to an area of practice, or an area in which we might practice, or a subject of study. It's sort of intentionally a vague, cloudy shape. It's not meant to be a precise idea. But what I think is important is that we implement theory in areas. This is certainly how I was brought up. And so practice came out of this. So that what you did, the way you acted, the things that you did came from having a good theory. And in this case, theory is prioritized. It tells us what to do. And for me, this has become more and more of a problem. Let's just summarize it like this, that the key notion here is applied. Now, for me, the problem with applied is that it's a power word. It's a word, application is something you put on something else. Of course, there are other meanings of the word, but this is certainly one of the dictionary definitions. You apply this to this, and that's a power move. And that means that there is a one-directional process. We have something which we apply to something else. Well, we have problems, of course, when, for instance, we say, well, my area of practice is theory. So, if I am a theorist, my practice is making theories. So I'm immediately in a problem when I talk about this notion of application, because the thing can't, in that sense, be applied to itself, because there can't be any power relationship between theory and theory. They're the same. So this is my problem with the notion of theory. We can do it the other way around. What happens if my theory is practice? So we get practice applied to practice. Let me see if I can get this a little bit lighter. Well, it's always a problem with these things, choosing the colors and knowing what background lighting is going to be like. I hope you can read it. Good. So we have, I think, a considerable problem here. It's a sort of logical problem. It's the problem of self-reference, of course. But it comes, I believe, from using this power word, applied. Now, let me talk about this using a slightly different set of words. I don't know about you, but I was always told that you have to understand things in order to be able to act. That you shouldn't act until you understand things. Don't do it until you know what you're doing. This sort of thing. Yeah? That's what I grew up with. And I find that very intriguing. Here we are. This is the sort of, I believe, is the approach of science. That science gets us so we can understand, and then, as a result of understanding, we can act. This isn't a definition of science. It's one of the things that it does. On the other hand, Jean Piaget, the psychologist who invented child developmental psychology, I think, demonstrated to us very convincingly that babies act in order to understand. They have no understanding, they act, and from acting, they build understandings, that they construct their own worlds. That's not that they construct the world outside. I'm not going to get into that sort of argument, but how they understand the world is something that they construct through acting in it and thinking about this. Or actually, Piaget would, I think, say that that's the origin of the thinking about it. So, for Piaget, we act in order to understand. And if Piaget is right, all of us started by acting in order to understand. And this is not the way that we normally describe our world and our relationship to it. So I think that we have to understand that acting and understanding are not in a power relationship, that the word applied is inappropriate. So let's slightly change the representation. Let's turn it into a circle. So let me now talk for a moment about circularities. Circularities are the bread and butter of cybernetics. We can talk about the circle between understanding and acting, and I will just articulate it like this. And I will give it some dynamics so that we understand in order to act, and we act in order to understand. And now we understand, sorry about this repetition of the word, very second order and recursive. But we understand that these two exist in a relationship together, and that what we might do in order to get over this problem of priority or circularity, if we see circularity as a problem, is to treat this as a unity. That is, acting and understanding go together, instead of understanding leading to acting. There are, of course, many other of these sorts of circular relationships, and one which I'd like to spend just a moment on is this: society and individual. I was at a conference last week where one of the people who I really ought to agree with got up and talked about everything as existing in the social realm. And for me, the way that I understand the world begins with the individual. It doesn't begin in society. And I think these are two essentially different ways of looking at the world, but they can't exist without the other. It's a matter of where you begin. It's not a matter of how you conceptualize it, and there I think we get confused between the conceptualization and the beginning. So let's look at it through sociology and psychology for a moment, and I'd like to give you an example from Noam Chomsky. Chomsky talked about this concept, freedom. This is in an interview in The Listener, which was a journal the BBC published weekly until about 1980. It was a terrific journal. And this was, as I say, an interview with Chomsky from 1967. And in it, he was talking about the problems that the Russians and the Americans had with each other. Chomsky, of course, is a Russian name, but interestingly, for a professor of linguistics, the only language he spoke was English, or speaks, is English. All right, freedom. Chomsky said that for the Russians, the notion of freedom begins in society. What he said was freedom for a Russian means freedom to serve and be in society. And he said for an American, we have something quite different. Freedom means the freedom to do what you want, to choose regardless of society. So that for the Russians, freedom was a social thought, a social idea, whereas for Americans, it's an individual idea. And he said that while there is this different understanding of what we think is the same word, there is no communication. When we talk about freedom, we will go on talking in ways where we don't understand each other. And we must surely recognize what Chomsky said as we talk about freedom with different people in the world, that clearly what they mean by freedom and what you Americans mean by freedom and what we Europeans mean by freedom and so on are not necessarily the same. Sometimes they're so different that there's no connection except the sound of the word. Another one of these, I think, interesting unities is mind and body. And you, of course, know that mind and body have been a problem. The relationship between them has been a problem ever since Descartes. And I'm sure there were people who found a problem before that. And it's a strange thing, this. If you believe in some sort of physical world, it's very strange that we treat them as separate. So what Gregory Bateson, for instance, insisted on was that mind and body are in an indivisible unity. And so what I'd like to get at here is that sometimes we have these pairs of concepts which we tend to treat as starting with one and ending with the other, but which would be more helpfully thought of if we could think of them as somehow going together and being indivisible. I happen to like this little quote from Maxwell above, which shows a very interesting spin on the mind-body problem. Maxwell was, for me, one of the most remarkable minds and came up with some of the most fantastic understandings. He made two mistakes. One was belonging to the wrong college of the University of London. Instead of University College, he made the mistake of going to King's College, which is sort of unforgivable. And the second thing is being Scottish, but that's just an Englishman's prejudice. Actually, I'm Irish, so I shouldn't dislike them. There you go. All right. So I'd like to now consider for a moment understanding and acting, or go back to that, and just place this together with a couple of other concepts. I want to bring theory and practice into this. And I also would like to bring in science and design. For me, design is something which gives us a different way of looking at the world. It is a terrible mistake to try to make design scientific. It's an enormous mistake. We fuss about every little bug that we lose in the Amazon, but we don't seem to fuss about the attempt to have us all think using only one model for thinking. And I think design and designing and designers do something which is really quite extraordinary. I'm not going to go into it here. I've talked about it in previous years when I've been lucky enough to give one of these breakfast addresses. But let me just say that designing is a completely different way of being in the world than doing science. And they complement each other. Design starts from acting, and science starts from understanding. And of course you'll tell me I'm wrong, because science starts from acting, doing experiments and all sorts of things, which just shows that this sort of prioritizing and creating distinctions is fraught with danger, and I think it's an argument for what I'm talking about, that we need both and we need them together. I'm going to add another thing, KO and KF. There's been a lot of work done on different ways of knowing, hasn't there? And different types of knowledge. We just heard, for instance, about ancient Greek divisions, and there's still an enormous amount to be got from remembering the praxis and I forget all the Greek words, which is awful, but anyway, the knowledge that you have in the hands, for instance, for the knowledge that the craftsman has, this sort of thing, which are not intellectualized or intellectualizable bits of knowledge, ways of knowing. And there's been, for instance, mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge, which are not all that remote from what Carl was talking about yesterday when he talked about his 3 modes of doing science. And I have a distinction that I use, which is the difference between knowledge of and knowledge for, KO and KF. This difference comes from a Dutch androgologist who I worked with for many years, who talked about the difference between models of and models for. And a model of describes the world as it is, and a model for helps us change the world. And of course, scientists essentially describe the world as it is. They want to know how it is and how it works and so on. And designers aren't interested in that at all. Designers want to make new things. That is, designers want to change the world. And we have an enormous prioritization of knowledge of over knowledge for. And the way that we try to deal with that is by having technology which translates things. And I think that perhaps we would do better to get more knowledge which is directly for action, directly for acting. Okay. So, understanding and acting, and what we have now is that they interact with each other. That's what this circle means, and that there's something shared about them. And as I've put in the middle, there's a betweenness. What's important in understanding and acting in this relationship is not only that they're circular, but that there is a space between them which allows this interaction to happen. It allows the sharing to take place. Well, this was really, it's a restatement, it's a radical restatement, because Schoen never drew diagrams like this, of what Donald Schoen talks about in a book called The Reflective Practitioner. Schoen is the man who brought the word reflection back into academic work. Reflectare is the Latin origin. And what's interesting about reflection is that there are actually 2 words. If you think of it, you can probably spell it 2 ways. So there's the CT way, and then there's the X way. So we have reflection and reflection. And if you look in the dictionary, this is my Oxford dictionary, you will find that reflection is very big and it's full of things and so on. And at the bottom it says reflection with an X. Reflection with an X is, and I'll read it in case you can't see it, an archaic spelling of reflection. It's interesting that reflection with an X has sort of taken off in another way. We talk about reflexivity theory. So George Soros, for instance, talks about this. Which is really another way of talking about the things that second-order cybernetics is interested in. So it seems that the X spelling should have a sort of special place. So I'm going to propose that we keep these 2 spellings and that we're going to come up with a slightly different meaning for each of them. When Schoen wrote his book, The Reflective Practitioner, he based it on the following assumption. He said, there are people who practice professions who have ways of learning and constantly developing their knowledge which have nothing to do with the academy. They don't take place in the academy doesn't recognize them, it doesn't know what this is, but that there is this completely different way of doing things. And it's a way of learning and knowing through reflection. Reflection in practice and reflection in action were the terms that he used. And the people who he examined were an engineer, that's in this book, an architect, a manager, a psychotherapist, and a town planner. And you might say, actually, that's only two professions, because management and psychotherapy sometimes are put together. And engineer, architect, and town planner, some people think are the same. I don't think many architects think that they're the same as engineers, but quite a lot of engineers think they're the same as architects. So, now I want to make this difference between the two, the reflective and the reflexive. The reflective is the Schoen sort of approach, and it involves deep thinking and contemplation. These come from the dictionary definition. In reflectiveness, what happens is you change the theory. You also change the people. So when I reflect on something, not only do I change the way that I know about the thing I'm reflecting on, I also change myself and my behavior. So when I'm doing reflective, as opposed to reflexive work, I change with the value. I change with the value. And that's reflection in action, the reflective practitioner. In the reflexive, what we're concerned with is a system behavior. And it's iterative and recursive, and what changes is the value within the system. So it's only the value changes. And an example of this is an eigenform and value. So let me give you a typical eigenform. It's a very, very simple one, this. You probably all know this, but it's just in case some of you don't. This is an example that Heinz von Förster, who Carl mentioned yesterday, was an enthusiast, well, liked to use as his example. It shouldn't be taken to be the whole of the field. It is one tiny and very simple example. I might be the circle on the left, and there's some process on the right, and here's what happens. I'm going to divide a number by 2 and add 1, and I'm going to do it recursively. So I start with 6, divide it by 2, I get 3, add 1, I get 4. So I start with 4, divide by 2, get 2, add 1, I get 3. So I put 3 in, I end up with 1.5, and I get 2.5. I put 2.5 in, end up with 1.25, and add 1, 2.25, and I'll put 2.25 in. Well, I'm not going to go on and on and on forever. You can see what happens, and you can test it. When I get to the number 2, I have a number which reproduces itself. That is the eigenvalue of this particular eigenform. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, plus 1 is 2. So the process leads to a stable and particular value. And that stable and particular value is what comes out of this process of reflection with an X, as I want to call it. And it, meaning the system, does not change. All that changes is the value that's going round within the system. Donald Schoen's notion is a little bit different. This diagram took me about a day to make, let me tell you. It's incredibly simple, but I didn't have the right software as part of the problem, but this took a really long time. So I hope that you realize it took a long time, but you don't see it. So, same items, and I reflect on this thing, and by reflecting on whatever the square thing is, so by reflecting on that, I change it. I don't actually necessarily make it bigger, but I will show it as getting bigger just for the purposes of this demonstration. And in doing that, I change myself, and I get bigger. And because I am now different than I was just before, when I look at whatever it is I'm reflecting on, not only has it changed, but I have changed. So I need to reconsider what it is. So I look again, and in doing so, I change it again. And therefore, I change myself. Yeah? So in this case, what happens is that not only does the value in the circle change, but also the components themselves change themselves. They redesign themselves. All right, little summary. We can distinguish between two types of reflection, one with an X, one with a CT. I'm sure that other people have distinguished the other way round, but I haven't found those distinctions. And we can summarize the ideas that I've been trying to talk about by this modification of the diagram. That is, let's put reflection in the middle. Reflection is the process that goes on. It's a way of describing the unity of the elements here, which are understanding and acting, which are associated with knowledge of and knowledge for. All right. That's what I had wanted to say. I'd wanted to go through and look what happens when, for instance, you don't assume that understanding leads to action, but you assume that action equally leads to understanding. When we delinearize our world and when we start looking in that way and what we can do about this. Because for me, one of the things I have tried to do is to learn to live in this cybernetic way. And why have I done that? Well, what I learnt was that you've had your good idea by the time you're 28 or you won't have it. Yeah? If you're going to do something radical and remarkable and amazing in mathematics, for instance, if you're over 28, it's too late. You can do backup stuff, but you've had to hit it by the time you're 28. And I think that's what this German guy was referring to with me, that the early stuff, and I did it, some of it much after I was 28, but anyway, I did my PhD when I was 28, that stuff he found incredibly exciting, and he wondered what had happened since. Well, what I'm talking about is what we can do when we get to be over 28 in research. What I'm talking about is that we can actually start thinking about not what our ideas are, but how to live with them, how those become a way of acting, how we can move beyond the power play of application and start not saying, here's a good idea, let's apply it, and we know how often that has led to really terrible consequences. And instead of doing that, we can say, here is a way of living with these ideas. It's a sort of organic way. Sorry to sound like Prince Charles. It's an organic way, and it's something which eventually, by our ability to live with it and in it, rather than force it onto things, becomes, as it were, an inspiration, but also leads to new ways of understanding and being in the world. And goodness knows we need a lot of that at the moment. So thank you very much. I think we've finished on time. I think everyone needs coffee. I'll be around if anyone wants to talk. And otherwise, please enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you to all of you for being here, but thank you especially to Najib and team for year after year managing to make this extraordinary event work. I don't think that we realize a fraction of what's involved in doing this. Anyone who's organized a conference knows how hard it is. To do it year after year, 3 times a year, is an extraordinary achievement. So what we should do actually is to get Najib to stand up, and we should all applaud him.